Welcome to Occult Archives,
Yeah, welcome.
where we uncover the mysteries, myths, and legends behind history's most feared books.
That's right.
These aren't, your beach reads.
No.
We're talking about volumes whispered about in hushed tones, texts rumored to hold secrets so potent they were deemed dangerous.
Yeah.
Think mystical grimoires, perhaps even ancient religious scrolls,
Absolutely.
books that have sparked fascination and, at times, fear.
And as we navigate this often shadowy terrain, we aim to illuminate the historical context and the enduring influence of these intriguing works.
Today, in episode 139, we're tackling something truly foundational.
All right.
We're venturing into the world of alchemy,
Okay.
and a key text known as the Turba Philosophorum, or Assembly of the Sages.
Right.
Now, this is a dense piece of work, a collection of voices from across the alchemical tradition.
It is.
It can feel like trying to grasp smoke.
Yeah.
So to really get to the heart of its core ideas, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a related and in some ways more accessible text, the Alchemical Catechism.
Exactly. Think of the Catechism as offering a more direct route into understanding the fundamental principles that underpinned alchemical thought. It's structured as a series of questions and answers, almost like a primer, giving us a concentrated view of how these early thinkers conceptualized the very nature of reality.
Precisely. And that's what makes it so valuable for us.
Right.
Our mission today, for you tuning in, is to unpack this alchemical understanding of nature and matter.
Okay.
We want to extract those key insights, providing a shortcut to grasping this complex worldview.
That's the goal.
So you can begin to see the world as they did through the fascinating lens of alchemical philosophy.
Right.
The Alchemical Catechism itself tells us its focus is on understanding the operations of nature.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Right.
What was the central focus for these early philosophers, according to the Catechism? What were they really trying to figure out?
The text is quite explicit on this. The primary pursuit, the core investigation for a philosopher, and when we say philosopher, here we're talking about someone deeply engaged in seeking wisdom about the natural world, was the exploration of how nature actually operates.
Right.
This wasn't just surface-level observation, it was an intense, systematic inquiry into the fundamental mechanisms at play in the world around them.
Right. It wasn't enough to just see an apple fall from a tree. They wanted to understand the underlying forces governing that event.
Absolutely.
And what did they identify as the ultimate source, the very beginning and end of all this natural activity? What was the big picture for them?
For them, the ultimate answer lay in the divine. The Catechism states very clearly that the ultimate purpose and the beginning of nature is God.
Okay.
This firmly places alchemical thought within a spiritual context.
Right.
Nature wasn't viewed as some random assortment of events, but as something intentionally created and ultimately connected back to its creator. It's a very different perspective from a purely scientific materialism, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. That spiritual foundation is key.
Yeah.
And from this single divine origin, where did all the diverse elements and substances we encounter in the world come from? How did they explain that multiplicity?
From one and indivisible nature.
Okay.
Despite the sheer variety of substances and phenomena we observe, the alchemists believed in an underlying unity. Everything, in their view, originated from a single fundamental principle, a primal nature that wasn't fragmented but inherently whole. It's a bit like saying all different programs on your computer ultimately run on the same underlying operating system.
So a single source, but then how do they account for the differences we see? How did this one unified nature manifest as so many distinct things?
The Catechism explains that this singular nature expresses itself through four pulmonary regions, which we recognize as the four elementary qualities: dry, moist, warm, and cold.
Okay.
Now, these weren't necessarily seen as physical substances in the way we understand elements like oxygen or nitrogen today, but rather as fundamental characteristics that combined in varying degrees to give rise to the different materials we encounter. Think of them like the primary colors that can be mixed to create a vast spectrum of hues.
So the classical elements, not as substances themselves, but as fundamental qualities.
Yeah.
And beyond these qualities, how else did they perceive nature differentiating itself? Were there other fundamental distinctions?
They also identified a differentiation into male and female principles within nature.
Interesting.
This wasn't just a metaphorical or poetic way of speaking. It was a core concept suggesting a kind of cosmic interplay between active and passive forces that drove the various natural processes. It's a way of seeing dynamism and receptivity at the heart of how things work.
Interesting. So these fundamental qualities, dry, moist, warm, cold, and these male and female principles are at play in everything.
Right.
The Catechism then makes a comparison to help illustrate the nature of nature itself.
Yeah.
What does it liken it to?
It compares nature to mercury. Now, when you hear mercury in an alchemical context, it's important not to immediately think of the shiny liquid metal,
Right,
although that substance certainly held a significant symbolic role for them.
right.
Here, mercury likely represents a more philosophical idea, something fluid, volatile, and transformative, embodying the ever-changing and dynamic aspects of nature itself. It's the principle of change and transmutation.
That makes perfect sense given the symbolic weight Mercury carried in alchemical thought.
Right.
So, to summarize their initial understanding of nature, how does the Catechism offer a concise definition, a kind of quick snapshot?
It defines nature as something invisible yet operating visibly. It's described as a volatile spirit residing within physical bodies, and it's animated by a universal spirit which they often equated to the divine breath, the very spark of creation, or a central universal fire that gives life to everything that exists. So you have this hidden energetic force that manifests in the tangible world, all ultimately driven by a kind of divine spark. What kind of person do you think would be best suited to try and understand something so complex and multifaceted?
That's a good question. Given that description, it sounds like you'd need someone with a very particular set of qualities. According to the Catechism, what kind of person did they believe was best equipped to examine nature? What traits did an alchemist, a philosopher in their terms, need to cultivate?
The Catechism suggests that those who seek to understand nature should, in a way, strive to mirror nature itself.
Hmm.
This translates to possessing qualities like truthfulness, simplicity, patience, and perseverance.
Okay.
It's a reminder that delving into the intricate workings of the natural world requires a dedicated and perhaps surprisingly a virtuous approach.
Right.
It wasn't just about intellectual prowess, it was about character.
It's almost like you need to be in harmony with your subject of study. And once these essential qualities were in place, what should these examiners then focus their attention on? What should guide their investigations?
Their focus needed to be on ensuring that their goals and their methods aligned with the fundamental principles of nature. They had to carefully consider whether their aims were actually possible and achievable within the natural framework. The text emphasizes that if they sought to accomplish something that nature ordinarily does, they had to meticulously observe and imitate her processes in every detail. It's about working with nature, not against it.
Imitation is a key to innovation, in a way.
Right.
And how could they then go beyond mere imitation? How could they improve upon nature's processes, perhaps even accelerate or perfect them?
The Catechism states that any improvement or enhancement is invariably achieved by using like nature. So, for example, if an alchemist wanted to enhance the inherent virtues of a particular metal, they had to work with the specific metallic nature of that substance, understanding its unique characteristics, including those male and female differentiations we talked about earlier. It's about amplifying what's already present within the material.
So it's about understanding the inherent potential and working to bring that out. This leads us to the concepts of seed and germ. Where did the alchemists believe the fundamental essence, the potential of metallic nature was stored?
According to the Catechism, the metallic nature stored its seeds within the four elements: dry, moist, warm, and cold.
Okay.
This reinforces their fundamental view that these basic qualities weren't just characteristics, but were the very matrix within which the potential for different substances resided. The seed, in a sense, was encoded within these elemental qualities.
And with what specific aspect of a substance did the philosopher believe they could truly accomplish their transformative work? Not just the raw elements themselves, but something more refined and potent.
The key was the germ of a given matter. This was considered the elixir, or quintessence, the most essential and potent aspect of a substance, far more valuable and effective for the alchemist's purposes than the raw, undifferentiated material. They believed that before any significant work could begin, they had to identify and extract this vital seed or germ. It's like the concentrated active ingredient in a medicine.
This idea of a concentrated essence is central to so much of alchemical thought.
Right.
And how exactly did they define this germ or seed of a substance? What were they trying to isolate at this crucial stage?
The Catechism defines it as the most subtle and perfect decoction and digestion of the substance itself. It goes on to equate it with the balm of sulfur, which it identifies as being identical to the radical moisture of
Hmm.
metals. So you have this concept of a highly concentrated life-giving essence that's linked to both sulfur, representing the fiery active principles, and a fundamental moisture seen as the very lifeblood of metals. It's a fascinating combination of seemingly opposing forces.
So a potent union of fiery and watery principles at the heart of matter. And by what force or process was this essential seed or germ believed to be created in the first place?
It was believed to be brought into being by the four elements, but crucially under the influence and direction of the divine will and through the active power of nature's own imagination.
Okay.
So once again, we see that interplay between a higher divine influence and the active formative power inherent in nature itself. It's not just random chance, there's a guiding intelligence at work.
It's almost a partnership then between the divine and the natural realms in the creation of fundamental essences.
Right.
Now, how did these four elements actually go about this process of creation, of depositing their seeds within the earth?
The Catechism describes an ongoing and uniform motion. Each element, driven by its inherent quality, continuously deposits its seed in the center of the earth. Now, this wasn't necessarily the physical center of the planet as we understand it, but rather a more theoretical, almost symbolic void, where these seeds were subjected to action and a kind of internal digestion before being expelled outwards by the fundamental laws of movement. Think of it as a cosmic processing center.
A theoretical void acting as a kind of cosmic crucible, in a sense.
Yeah.
And where did the elements then expel and deposit these seeds after this central processing? Where did they end up?
In the X center, or the margin and circumference of this theoretical center, after each element had taken its own portion, any surplus would then be cast out into regions associated with waste impurities, fire, and a kind of formless chaos. It's a picture of a dynamic system of intake transformation at a central point and then distribution outwards, with anything deemed impure being cast aside.
They really had a very specific mental model of how this entire process worked.
They did.
To help illustrate this, the Catechism provides a rather vivid analogy.
Right.
Can you walk us through that?
The analogy involves a table with a vase of pure water in the center, surrounded by various colored substances and salt. When the water is poured out, it flows over these different materials, and in doing so, takes on some of their characteristics, perhaps a red tinge from a red pigment or a salty flavor from the salt. The key point here is that the water itself doesn't fundamentally change the nature of the places it passes through,
Right.
but rather the diverse characteristics of those places modify the appearance or properties of the water. This illustrates how the fundamental seed deposited at the Earth's center is believed to be modified as it passes through different environments within the Earth, ultimately resulting in the variety of substances we observe on the surface. It's the journey that shapes the final form.
That's a really clear and helpful analogy. It really emphasizes the role of the surrounding environment in shaping the final characteristics of a substance.
Right.
Now let's move on to the concept of first matter. What did the alchemists consider to be the true and initial substance from which all metals originated? What was their fundamental building block?
The Catechism describes the first matter of metals as being dual in its essence, or of a twofold nature. It identifies the first and the palmary essence as an aerial humidity, almost like a subtle vaporous moisture blended with a warm air taking the form of a fatty water that has the characteristic of adhering to all substances regardless of their apparent purity. It's a very subtle, almost ethereal starting point.
An aerial humidity, almost like a primordial, subtle, vaporous essence.
Right.
And what specific name did the philosophers give to this fundamental first matter?
They called it mercury. And again, it's crucial to remember that this likely isn't just referring to the physical metal we know as mercury, but rather a symbolic representation of this primal fluidic substance that they believed underlay all metallic being. It's the principle of fluidity and potentiality.
And what celestial bodies were believed to exert influence over this this philosophical Mercury? Was there a cosmic connection?
Yes, the rays of the sun and moon were seen as governing it, highlighting the interconnectedness between the terrestrial and celestial realms in alchemical thought. They believed that influences from the heavens played a crucial role in the development of substances on Earth.
So this airy, watery essence influenced by the sun and moon is the first matter. What then was considered the second matter? What came next in their foundational understanding?
The second matter was identified as the warmth of the earth. In other words, the dry heat that the philosophers termed sulfur.
Okay.
So right from the beginning, you have this fundamental duality established. a moist, airy mercury representing the feminine or receptive principle, and a dry, fiery sulfur representing the masculine or active principle. These two are constantly interacting.
These two principles, mercury and sulfur, constantly reappear in alchemical discussions. Now, could the entire physical body of material be converted into this essential seed? Was it a one-to-one transformation?
No, according to the Catechism, only a very small portion could approximately 1/800th part.
Wow.
The text uses the example of a grain of wheat, suggesting that the vital seed is secreted within the very center, a tiny but potent kernel within the larger structure.
Uh,
It's like the idea that only a small amount of DNA carries the blueprint for an entire organism.
So a tiny, potent kernel residing within the larger structure. What then was the purpose of the bulk of the material, if only such a small fraction could become the essential seed?
The bulk of the matter served as a protective envelope, safeguarding the precious seed against extremes of heat, cold moisture dryness, and other potentially harmful influences. It was seen as a necessary buffer, a kind of protective shell for the vital germ within.
Like a protective shell around a delicate core.
Yes.
And what about those who might try to bypass this and attempt to reduce the entire material body directly into seed? Would they achieve anything of value?
The Catechism is quite dismissive of this idea, stating that such an endeavor would be wholly unproductive, a wasted effort.
Okay.
It emphasizes that nothing of real value can be accomplished by deviating from nature's own established methods. The alchemists firmly believed in working in accordance with nature's inherent processes, not trying to force unnatural or shortcutted transformations.
So it was absolutely crucial to work with nature's rhythms and processes, not against them. What then was the correct approach? What specific actions needed to be taken to find and isolate this essential seed within a substance?
The key was the effective separation of the essential matter from its impurities. The text points out that even the metals that appear to us as the purest weren't entirely free from imperfections in the alchemical view.
Hmm.
These superficial layers, the dross and superfluities, had to be carefully peeled away and purged to reveal the true seed hidden within. It's a process of intense refinement, of getting down to the essence.
It's a process of refinement, of stripping away the inessential layers to reveal the pure core.
Exactly.
Now, what was of utmost importance for the philosopher to pay attention to in this quest for the seed? What was the ultimate aim?
Assuredly, it was understanding and ultimately achieving the end of nature in existence. However, the Catechism immediately cautions that this ultimate goal wasn't to be found in what they called vulgar metals, those metals that had already been extracted, processed, and worked by human hands. Once they had been fashioned into artifacts, their vital connection to the raw living processes of nature was seen as significantly diminished, if not lost entirely.
Why couldn't this end of nature, this perfected state, be found in ordinary metals, especially something as seemingly pure as gold?
Because vulgar metals, and chiefly gold, were considered absolutely dead, while the metals that the philosophers were truly interested in were absolutely living and possessed what they considered to be a soul. This fundamental distinction between living philosophical metals and dead vulgar metals is absolutely key to understanding their approach. It wasn't just about chemical composition, it was about a vital essence.
This idea of metals having a life and a soul is fascinating and perhaps a bit surprising to modern ears.
It is.
What exactly did they consider to be the life force of metals? What animated them in this living state?
It was no other substance than fire, but specifically when the metals were still embedded within the mines, deeply connected to the natural geological processes occurring within the earth, it was a kind of subterranean inherent fire that represented their vitality.
So a kind of deep internal natural fire emanating from the earth itself.
Right.
And what then constituted the death of these metals in their view? What extinguished this life force?
Their life and death were seen as two sides of the same elemental coin, both involving fire. They lived by that natural internal fire within the earth, but they died through the fire of fusion, the intense heat applied during human processing when the ore was smelted and refined. So the very act of extracting and working them was seen as severing their connection to that original life force.
The very process we use to obtain and purify them was seen as a kind of alchemical death.
Right.
How then did they believe metals were initially formed within the earth? What was their conception of this subterranean genesis, this natural creation process?
They believed that when the four elements had fully developed their inherent powers within the Earth's center and had deposited their essential seeds, the archeists of nature, a kind of vital animating force inherent in the natural world, would then sublime these seeds towards the surface through the warmth and energy of perpetual subterranean movement. It's a picture of a natural distillation process occurring deep underground, driven by elemental forces and this vital arceus.
A natural ongoing process happening constantly deep beneath our feet.
Right.
This leads to the question of the elements themselves. What did they believe happened when one of the more subtle elements was distilled through the earth? What was the result of this process?
It was believed to resolve itself into water, which
Oh.
they considered the very source of all things, the fundamental interrober.
Hmm.
In this initial state, it was merely a humid vapor.
Okay.
And from this vapor, the principiated principle of all substances was subsequently evolved, serving as the primary first matter for the philosopher's alchemical work. So a transformation from airy substance to watery essence.
So water, in its vaporous form, was seen as a primary building block,
Yeah.
the fundamental stuff of creation.
Yes.
And what exactly was this principiated principle that the alchemists used as their initial material, their starting point?
It was this very same matter, the humid vapor, which at the precise moment of its conception received a permanent and unchangeable form.
Okay.
It's the initial undifferentiated substance that then begins to take on specific characteristics and properties, its potential becoming actuality.
So a formless potential taking on definition. What about the familiar planetary metals, Saturn, lead, Jupiter,
Yeah.
Mars, iron, and the precious metals sun, gold, and moon, silver? Did they believe each of these had its own fundamentally unique seed?
No, they believed that one common seed underlay them all. Their apparent differences arose not from having fundamentally different seeds, but from the specific locality within the earth where they were formed, and the varying speed at which nature completed her transformative work. For instance, they believed that silver in its formation developed more quickly than gold. Think of it like different fruits developing at different rates on the same tree.
So environmental factors and the pace of natural development were seen as the key factors, accounting for the variations we see in different metals.
Right.
How did they envision the specific formation of gold within the earth? What was the alchemical recipe, so to speak, happening underground?
They imagined a vapor sublimed in the Earth's center, passing through warm and pure places where a kind of sulfurous grease naturally adhered to the channels and fissures within the Earth. This vapor, which they often referred to as their philosophical mercury, would then combine with this grease, essentially dissolving and carrying it along.
Right.
This amalgamation produced an unctuous substance that then abandoned its vaporous form and became a more fixed, greasy substance. This, in turn, would be further sublimated in other, more purified areas of the earth, gradually filling its pores and ultimately solidifying as gold. It's a detailed, almost poetic depiction of a geological process viewed through a very specific alchemical lens.
It's a detailed, almost poetic description of a geological process viewed through an alchemical lens.
That's right.
What about the less perfect metals like Saturn, lead, and Venus, copper? How did they believe those came into being? Were the processes similar?
Saturn was thought to be engendered when the same unctuosity, this greasy substance, passed through places within the Earth that were totally impure and characterized by coldness. Venus, on the other hand, was believed to form in localities where the Earth itself was relatively pure, but was mingled with impure sulfur.
Okay.
So again, impurities in the surrounding environment during their formation played a crucial role in determining the characteristics of these imperfect metals. It's like the idea that imperfections in the initial ingredients will lead to an imperfect final product.
Again, the environment playing a key role in shaping the outcome.
Absolutely.
And what kind of inherent power did this central vapor possess within the Earth, according to their understanding? What was its natural activity?
Through its continuous movement, it had the inherent power to perpetually rarefy to make less dense and more pure anything crude and impure that it encountered,
Right.
while at the same time actively attracting all that was pure around it. It was seen as a constant agent of refinement working deep within the earth.
A natural purifier constantly at work beneath our feet.
Exactly.
This brings us back to the very beginning, to the fundamental essence.
Okay.
What did they consider to be the seed of this first matter of all things? The seed of the principiating principles. Where did it all start?
The Catechism states that this first matter seed was begotten by nature itself from the elements, without the need for assistance from any other pre-existing seed. Nature, in its fundamental creative capacity, received the basic matter from the elements, and then, through its own inherent power, brought forth the initial seed. It's a self-contained generative process at the very foundation of existence.
So a self-contained generative process at the very foundation.
Right.
And in absolute terms, when you strip away all the layers, what did they consider the ultimate seed of all things to be? What was the most fundamental starting point?
Absolutely speaking, the seed in any physical body was considered to be nothing other than congealed air or humid vapor,
Okay.
which then needed to be dissolved by a warm vapor to become active and manifest its potential. It's this subtle and continuous interplay between airy and vaporous states that they saw as absolutely fundamental to all generation and transformation in the natural world.
This constant cycling and transformation of incredibly subtle substances.
Right.
How did this fundamental principle apply specifically to the metallic kingdom? How is the essential seed generated within metals?
Through the agency of Archeus, that vital force of nature we mentioned earlier, the four elements in the initial stages of nature's work distilled a heavy vapor of water into the very center of the earth. This condensed vapor was considered to be the seed of metals and was called mercury, not because of its inherent essence being identical to the liquid metal, but primarily because of its fluid nature and its remarkable ability to adhere to everything it encountered. So the name was descriptive of its properties, not its ultimate composition.
So the name mercury was more about its characteristic fluidity and ability to bind rather than its fundamental chemical makeup as we understand it today.
Exactly.
And why was this fundamental watery vapor also compared to sulfur in alchemical texts?
Because of its internal heat. Even though it originated as a watery vapor, it possessed an inherent fiery quality, a kind of latent energy which linked it conceptually to the active principle of sulfur. It's that constant alchemical theme of seemingly opposite qualities being inherently connected.
This duality, this interplay of opposing forces seems to be a recurring theme.
It is.
Now, when they referred to the mercury from which metals were composed, were they talking about ordinary vulgar mercury that you could find in the marketplace?
Absolutely not. They were referring exclusively to the mercury of the philosophers, a much more refined, essential, and conceptually distinct substance. Common or vulgar mercury was deemed unsuitable for their fundamental work,
Okay.
because just like other fully formed metals, it was considered to already contain its own developed seed, and therefore couldn't serve as that primal, undifferentiated seed they were seeking. It was already a finished product, not the raw potential.
So vulgar mercury was already a developed entity, not the foundational, undifferentiated potential they were trying to work with.
Yeah.
What then should be accepted as the true subject of their alchemical work? What was the core material they needed to focus on?
The seed alone. What they termed the fixed gain, and not the entire physical body of the metal, which they viewed as already differentiated into sulfur, the living male principle, and mercury, the living female principle. Their primary focus was on isolating and then working with this most fundamental, undifferentiated seed. It's about going back to the source.
The core essence, stripped away from its differentiated forms,
Right.
and what was believed to be the next crucial step after obtaining this fundamental seed. What did they need to do with it?
They believed that these separated male sulfur and female mercury principles, once purified, then had to be carefully rejoined to form a germ or a new starting point,
Okay.
which would then naturally proceed to the procreation of a more perfected fruit according to its inherent nature. This was the ultimate goal of transmutation and perfection. It's like an alchemical marriage intended to produce something superior.
A kind of alchemical marriage, a sacred union to produce a new, perfected substance.
Yes.
What was the specific role of the alchemist, the artists as they called them, in this critical operation of joining these principles?
The artist's role at this stage was essentially to act as a purifier and a guide. They were responsible for separating the subtle essential principles from the gross impure aspects.
Okay.
Once this purification was achieved, nature itself would then take over in the subsequent process of generation and perfection.
Okay.
The alchemist was more of a facilitator than a direct creator.
So the alchemist, as a skilled facilitator, preparing the ground and guiding nature's own inherent processes.
Precise.
To what ultimate principle was the entire philosophic combination, this process of transformation, finally reduced?
To the fundamental process of development of one into two, the initial separation of those essential principles, and then the subsequent reduction of those two purified elements back into one unified and now more perfected form. Nothing further was fundamentally required. It's a cycle of analysis and synthesis.
A seemingly simple yet profoundly significant cycle of separation and reunification at the heart of alchemical transformation.
Exactly.
Where did they believe one could find the essential seed and the inherent life of meals? And here, meals likely refers to minerals and other fundamental substances.
The seed of minerals, according to the Catechism, was considered to be fundamentally the water that resided in their very center, in their innermost heart. This wasn't necessarily free-flowing water, but more like an essential inherent moisture.
that inner vital moisture, again appearing as a key element.
It is.
How did nature work often? With the crucial assistance of art, the alchemist's skilled intervention in this process of nurturing and transforming this inner seed.
Any seed, regardless of its specific type, was considered to be ultimately useless unless it was carefully placed in a suitable matrix, which could be provided either by nature itself in the earth or by the deliberate skill and intervention of the alchemist's art in the laboratory. Within this matrix, the seed would then receive its essential life through the coction of the germ, a kind of internal processing and maturation, and the subsequent congelation or fixing of the pure particle, which they referred to as the fixed gain, the desired perfected essence.
So the right environment and a process of internal transformation were absolutely key for the seed to realize its full potential.
Absolutely.
How was this vital seed then nourished and preserved once it was in the suitable environment?
By the inherent warmth of its own body. Once the initial conditions were correctly established, it was seen as a self-sustaining process of growth and development driven by its own internal energy.
And what specific role did the artist, the alchemist, ultimately play in the realm of minerals in relation to the ongoing work of nature herself? Where did their skills become essential?
They primarily finished what nature on its own couldn't completely perfect due to the crudity of the air, the impure atmospheric influences that permeated all bodies on the surface of the earth, but didn't penetrate to the same degree within the protected environment of the earth's depths. The alchemist, through carefully controlled processes in their laboratory, provided a more refined and protected environment for the final stages of perfection to occur.
Overcoming the limitations and imperfections of the natural surface environment.
Right.
What kind of fundamental correspondence did they believe existed between different metals? Was there a hidden order or relationship?
Their correspondence was believed to be fundamentally linked to the positions and influences of the planets in the celestial sphere.
Okay.
They envisioned a hierarchical system with Saturn at the highest level, followed by Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon at the lowest. They believed that the influential virtues of the planets descended through this hierarchy, and that the transformation of one metal into another was generally easier to achieve from a higher celestial sphere to a lower one.
Okay.
The sun, representing gold, was seen as exerting influence over all other metals, but not being capable of being improved by those considered inferior to it. There was a particularly strong correspondence seen between Saturn and the Moon, with the sun occupying a central and influential position, and the philosopher was often advised to use the virtue of the sun to guide and influence these transformations.
A fascinating interplay between the celestial and terrestrial realms, with planetary influences shaping the very nature and potential for transformation of substances on Earth.
Right.
When the philosophers spoke of gold and silver as the very source of their alchemical matter, were they referring to the ordinary mind versions of these precious metals that were commonly available?
Absolutely not. As we touched on earlier, vulgar, commonly found silver and gold were considered to be alchemically dead, lacking that vital connection to the primal forces of nature. In contrast, the gold and silver of the philosophers were considered to be full of life, possessing that essential, untainted connection to nature's vital and transformative processes. It was a distinction between the processed and the inherently vital.
That core distinction between living and dead matter remained absolutely crucial to their understanding.
Yes.
So with all these foundational principles in mind, what was the ultimate goal of research and experimentation for these alchemical philosophers? What were they ultimately striving to achieve?
It was fundamentally twofold. First, to achieve a profound proficiency in the art of perfecting what nature had left in an imperfect or incomplete state within the mineral kingdom. And second, to ultimately attain the most coveted treasure of all the legendary philosophical stone itself.
Okay.
These two goals were deeply interconnected.
The legendary and elusive goal of alchemy.
Indeed.
And what exactly did they believe this transformative philosophical stone to be in its essence? What was its fundamental nature?
The stone was defined as nothing other than the radical humidity of the elements perfectly purified and brought into a state of sovereign fixation. This perfected stable moisture was believed to be the key to achieving great things, particularly in the realms of health and extending life, as they believed that the very essence of life resided exclusively within this vital, humid radical wall. It was the ultimate essence of vitality stabilized and perfected.
The essence of life and transformative power all contained within a perfected and stable moisture.
Precisely.
Where did they believe the central secret to achieving this remarkable substance ultimately lay?
The secret lay in truly understanding how to educe to bring forth from a state of potentiality into a state of active power the innate warmth or inner fire of nature that was believed to be enclosed within the very center of this radical humidity. It was all about unlocking the inherent energy and transformative potential that resided within the fundamental life-giving moisture.
Releasing that hidden potential, bringing it into active manifestation. What essential precautions did they believe were absolutely necessary to take to avoid failure in this grand and complex endeavor of creating the stone?
Great care and meticulous attention had to be paid to completely eliminate all impurities and any waste products from the initial matter. Only the essential kernel, which contained the entirety of the compound's inherent virtue and transformative power, was to be carefully conserved. Purity at every stage was absolutely paramount to success.
Stripping away all the dross and extraneous material to get to the pure, potent essence.
Exactly.
Why did they believe that this ultimate medicine, this fabled philosophical stone, held the potential to heal all kinds of diseases and prolong life? What was its mechanism of?